Our next speaker is Professor Ilya Somin. He's a professor of law at George Mason University and a prominent constitutional scholar focusing on civil liberty. Professor Somin, please.
Thank you so much. I'm obviously not an authority on Sharia law or any kind of religious law, but I think my role here is to talk about the constitutional and policy issues raised by these various anti-Sharia proposals that are out there, both in state legislatures and in the U.S. Congress. So George Washington famously said that the United States was founded to create an asylum for the poor and oppressed of all nations and religions. And early on, both he and other founding fathers emphasized that there was supposed to be religious liberty for all groups, including, by the way, for Muslims, even though at that time, of course, there were very few Muslims in the U.S., but nonetheless, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and others explicitly reference Muslims among the groups that would be protected by these principles. And of course, soon after the founding, the First Amendment was enacted to protect the free exercise of religion and also the freedom of speech, both of which, as we're about to see, are very relevant to these anti-Sharia proposals. So I'll first start out by just summarizing what these proposals are and what is being advocated. In different states, it's somewhat different, and obviously there are proposals in Congress as well, but there are 3 or 4 major categories of measures which fall into the bucket of anti-Sharia proposals. One is excluding Muslim private schools from school choice programs in places like Texas. Another is barring voluntary private religious Muslim communities. That has also been a matter of controversy in Texas and elsewhere. A third is barring people from using religious arbitration, using Sharia law, even if both sides to a dispute agree. Those who want to bar this say, like, it should not be allowed. And finally, most sweepingly, we have the so-called Preserving a Sharia-Free America Act, which, if enacted in Congress, would bar all Muslim non-citizens from the United States, or at least those who are described as Sharia law adherents, which of course would include all or nearly all practicing Muslims. And I think it's very clear that all of this just about, in fact, violates the First Amendment. It violates the Free Exercise Clause, which says Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion. Of course, originally that only bound the federal government, but getting in 1868, when the 14th Amendment was enacted, it was understood to bar states from engaging in laws that violate the free exercise of religion as well. And if people are targeted and punished because of their exercise of a particular religion or because of their beliefs, that very obviously violates the Free Exercise Clause. In addition, the Supreme Court has rightly held that the Free Speech Clause of the First Amendment also bans laws that target religious speech and expression. So many of these proposals would violate the Free Speech Clause as well. When it comes to proposals targeting non-citizens, it is sometimes argued, well, non-citizens don't have a constitutional right to be in the United States, and therefore it's permissible to punish or expel them for their religious beliefs. I think that's wrong because the Supreme Court has repeatedly held that discrimination with respect to government policies and benefits that are not themselves constitutional rights, if it's done on the basis of religion or other prohibited categories, it is still unconstitutional. For example, just a couple years ago, in the case of Carson versus Macon, the Supreme Court held that it was unconstitutional to exclude religious schools from a school choice program. There is no constitutional right to have a school choice program. The state of Maine, in this case, could have just abolished the program entirely. But if they have a school choice program, they cannot exclude religious schools simply on the basis of their being religious. And by the same logic, logic, a state like Texas could not exclude Muslim schools from a school choice program solely because they are Muslim. And more generally, if you were to take the view that the government can discriminate on the basis of religion in any program, which itself is not a constitutional right, that would have dire consequences for a wide range of issues. The Supreme Court has rightly rejected that kind of idea, and for good reason. For example, you could then have a law saying, well, you're only eligible for Social Security if you're a Christian, or only if you're a Republican, or if you're a Democrat. And you can say it's because Social Security benefits themselves are not a constitutional right, but that would very obviously be a threat to freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and so on. It is also sometimes said that maybe there's a general exclusion from constitutional protections for non-citizens. That simply isn't true, in that if you look at the First Amendment and most other constitutional rights, they are not phrased as protections for particular groups of people, but rather as general limitations on government power. And the Supreme Court has held in various contexts that non-citizens do have constitutional rights. There's some question about whether constitutional rights apply to initial exclusions of people not yet in the United States. I think they should apply to that, and the jurisprudence suggesting otherwise is wrong. We can talk more about that in questions, but at the very least, there is fairly broad agreement that for people within the United States, even if they're non-citizens, they generally have constitutional rights. For instance, if a non-citizen is charged with a crime, they have the same procedural rights to defend themselves as a citizen. If their property is taken by the government, they have the protection of the takings clause. They have to be paid just compensation, and so on. And so there is no immigration exception to the First Amendment and no non-citizen exception, and that's true for most other constitutional rights as well. There are a couple of exceptions. For instance, the Privileges or Immunities Clause of the 14th Amendment is specifically about privileged immunities of citizens. The Second Amendment, which protects the right to keep and bear arms, is phrased as being for the people. There is disagreement in the courts about who exactly the people are, whether they're U.S. citizens or all legal residents or some other group. But whatever can be said of that right, rights that are phrased in general terms and not specifically limited to citizens or to the people protect everybody, including non-citizens. And if we were to rule otherwise, it would set a dangerous precedent in a variety of respects, because obviously Muslims would not be the only group that could be discriminated against in that way. More generally, if these kinds of policies were enacted and the courts would somehow uphold them, it would be a set of dangerous precedent, and it would also cause severe harm. Obviously, it would create a precedent for discrimination against all sorts of other religions and religious minorities, Jews, conservative Christians, many others. In addition, it would actually bolster the very radical Islamism and terrorism that the advocates of these laws claim to oppose, in that the narrative of groups like ISIS, the Iranian government, and others is that the U.S. and perhaps the West generally are the enemies of all Muslims, and obviously the enactment of these laws and their enforcement would bolster that narrative. That is why, by the way, during Trump's first term, ISIS actually praised his anti-Muslim travel ban. They referred to it as the blessed travel ban, their words, not mine, because they knew it would bolster their propaganda and enable them to get more supporters. And more generally, the idea that most Muslims are somehow a threat to the U.S. is false. It is simply not the case that there is some one unified version of Sharia law in the Muslim world. There is no single Muslim religious authority like the Pope in Catholicism, and therefore there are a variety of interpretations, and most Muslims in the U.S. do not seek to impose some kind of religious theocracy or to recreate the Taliban or the Iranian government in the U.S. Indeed, as many people in this audience know better than me, many Muslims in the U.S. are here precisely because they fled those kinds of regimes, including in some cases people who aided U.S. forces against the Taliban during the war on terror. So deporting or excluding all these people would damage our economy and society, would cause needless religious conflict, and would help the very forces in the world that supporters of these laws claim that they want to oppose. Finally, very briefly, on a couple of possible real issues that supporters of these laws have managed to raise and why those issues to be addressed do not require any kind of sweeping religious discrimination or exclusion. There is the concern about U.S. recognition of possibly illiberal judgments done under Sharia law in other countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, and elsewhere, to the extent that this is a real issue where, for instance, one might recognize marriages where women were forced into them or illiberal child custody judgments and the like. There's an obvious solution that you just have specific laws barring recognition of those kinds of judgments, whether they come from Sharia courts or any other kind of courts. But there is no need to generally bar all recognition of religious court judgments from other countries, because many of them are perfectly defensible and reasonable. Indeed, there is an interesting irony that if the U.S. were to pass a law that barred all recognition of judgments by Sharia courts, a nation that would be very significantly affected would be Israel, because Israel actually has a system of religious courts for all family status law for the different groups in that country, including Muslims, who are 20% of the population. We should not have a categorical rule against recognizing those kinds of judgments. There is no need for it, and it would cause needless problems. The second issue is claims about Muslims having illiberal views or wanting to impose a theocratic system. I think the survey data suggests that's pretty clearly not true of most U.S. Muslims. To the extent that some do have those kinds of views, the proper remedy is simply to prevent those views from being implemented. We have a variety of constitutional guarantees that can prevent that. And more generally, as is noted by the previous speaker, Muslims are only about 1% of the U.S. population. Those who seek to impose a theocracy are a much smaller group. So I'm pretty confident that that group has no real chance of actually creating any kind of Muslim theocracy in the U.S., and there are many safeguards against it. The concern about terrorism is also there. The rate of terrorism among Muslim immigrants in the United States is actually no higher or maybe even lower than the general population. And again, to the extent that we worry about this, the proper solution is to ban and punish terrorism, not to somehow punish all Muslims everywhere. So more can be said about many of these issues, but for now, I'll stop, and I look forward to discussion and questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Somin.